We are so far removed from the idea of America and its minarchism written in the United States Constitution, where we have to bring her back to where she belongs. Thank you for listening to this episode of Chasing Life, Liberty, and Minarchy. Minarchists of the world, and welcome to this latest episode of Chasing Life, Liberty, and Minarchy. We are actually in the middle, or episode number 3 of our new series, The Moral Compass, Why the Minimal State is the Only Ethical State. I am your host, Roderick Threets, and I'm going to continue to bring you down this journey to small and minimal and limited government. Not just one out of the 3, all 3 at the same time. Because a small government is the only ethical state that is necessary. I want y'all to go ahead and like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Make sure you get it in. Make sure you're sharing this with your peoples. Make sure also, if you haven't done it yet, make sure if you're on Facebook, make sure you're following the Torch of Liberty Media Foundation also, so you can share that, because I am also broadcasting on Facebook through Torch of Liberty Media Foundation on there. So you can share that out as we're talking through here. It's live, so that people will be able to see that and, be able to engage with that and potentially come into, I know Facebook has its own chat room and people have a problem transitioning, which is fine as long as the message gets out. Matter of fact, for me, I'm going to share this myself right now. So it looks like it didn't do it automatically for me. So I need to handle that. But as I'm doing that, again, I thank everybody for, always staying consistent with us. And even though consistency is, I call myself out on this one, hasn't been where it's supposed to be, because I've had to take breaks, I've been sick or whatever the case may be, but nonetheless we are here and we're doing the things like we're supposed to, and I thank y'all for hanging in there with us. Last time when we talked, we established our non-negotiable ethical premise, right? And that was the fact that individual rights are absolute side constraints on all action. Let me say that again. Individual rights are vital and absolute side constraints on all action. We also concluded that any state action involving coercion for non-defense purposes is morally illegitimate. Tonight, we're going to drill down on the single most important ethical axiom in our philosophy. the non-aggression principle, or you hear me call it the non-aggression axiom. It's more of an axiom than a principle, but we'll keep it simple. We won't get into the syntax, right? But the non-aggression axiom, or people call it the NAP or the NAA, right? Now, the non-aggression axiom is the lens through which we determine whether the state's use of force is moral or immoral. And this evening, we will prove that adhering to the NAP, or the non-aggression axiom, forces the boundary of the state to be precisely that of minarchy. Okay? So in the first part of this episode, we're going to talk about defining the non-aggression axiom and the ethical line drawn by it. Okay? Now, in simple, the non-aggression axiom is, I like to call it an elegant and profound system that forbids the initiation of physical force or the threat of force against any person or their property. This is the cornerstone of moral interaction in a free society, right? If you accept the fact and right of self-ownership, okay? I want people to hear this, right? If you accept self-ownership, you must logically accept the non-aggression axiom. Because any initiation of force against a non-aggressor violates their right to control their own body and property. Let me say that again for the people in the back that are not listening, right? If you believe in the right of self-ownership, you have to accept by default to be logically consistent, as the cool kids say, right? You must logically accept the non-aggression axiom, because any initiation of force against a non-aggressor violates their individual rights to control over their body and the property, right? Now, let's establish a couple things here, right? And we're going to talk about the difference between retaliatory and initiatory force, okay? Because the non-aggression axiom establishes a crucial distinction, okay? Force can be used retaliatorily, right? Meaning in defense of or to rectify a wrong, but never initiatorily, right? Which means to start a conflict or be a protagonist, right? So when we look at these two axioms, okay, think about the retaliatory force as being the moral way, right? So, for example, right, let's use the stand your ground law in Florida, right? When we talk about stand your ground, a lot of states have stand your ground, right? But Florida, I'm using Florida because obviously I'm in Florida, right? If someone attacks you in a very threatening manner, you have the right to shoot that person. If you felt your life was at risk or under the threat of death, you have every right to kill that person. That would be moral because it's retaliatory. You're in defense of oneself. You're in defense of your body, which is your property, right? Now, the initiatory force is the immoral force. Okay? Let's use the stand your ground situation. Okay? The aggressor is never justified in using force to achieve a goal, no matter how good it is, if the target has not first committed aggression. I mean, we see this all the time, right? Again, citing the stand your ground law, right? If the aggressor survives the gunshot, he's going to jail with a bullet hole in him because he was the aggressor. He was the immoral party in this situation because the person he targeted was not acting in an aggressive manner, right? This is where us minarchists and libertarians alike see the dilemma, right? Because the state, again, the state meaning the government, right? Federal government, state government, local government, the state, by its nature, right, holds a monopoly on force, don't they? So, how does a coercive entity like the state adhere to a non coercive principle? The answer for me is very simple, and I'm sure you have it in your head, and you can type it in the chat what you think that answer is, right? As I'm saying my answer. But the answer is by limiting the scope of its force to the retaliatory category only, right? Because remember, initiatory, right, goes against the non-aggression axiom, aka, right, the United States sending military troops into countries that has not been aggressors towards the United States, right? No matter how noble the effort is, the United States government is acting as an initiatory force, which is immoral and against the NAP. Right? Let's get further into that a second, right? Okay, because the minarchist system demands that all state force must be responsible to a violation of rights. Okay, the United States, the current system in the United States fails this test constantly by initiating force. Right? Let me give you an example from a again minarchist government, right? Let's use the Florida Highway Patrol, for example, right? Highway patrolman issues a warrant, right, and detains a person who's committed fraud against the business. Okay, this would be an example of retaliatory force, right, to rectify a property rights violation, which is moral, right? Because what is one of the few functions of government, as we've talked about in our minarchist series, to uphold contracts and to protect property rights, right? So this would be a moral use of force, right? So let's use the current system we have here in the United States, right? The Florida Highway Patrol detains a person for driving without wearing a seatbelt. Okay? This is an example of initiatory force against the non-aggressor, right? Justified under the guise of public safety, right? Which would be immoral under the non-aggression axiom, right? Because there's no victim, right? And I want people to understand this. I mean, the laws are the laws, but I want people to understand this concept, right? They create this public safety model and say anything you do or break against this model, you are an aggressor. Well, the state is not a victim. The state cannot ever be a victim. So how is the person driving without a seatbelt an aggressor, right? It's a conundrum for you to think about. How did the state derive that authority to use their force to call you an aggressor against a non-victim? Because the laws are supposed to be for the people, not against the people. But the state, with the monopoly on force, flipped the paradigm, didn't they? Right? Just something to think about. So part 2, as we take a look here, I'm going to take a look at before we start part 2. I see a couple of questions in the chat. One of them being, if we as a citizen step in to save or protect another human being, I feel that that too is justifiable, and that is correct. It is justifiable. Understand your ground laws. That is correct. You are in defense of another individual being an aggressor. Yeah, so that would definitely stand. That's where your good Sam laws come into play, or good Samaritan. Yeah, I don't want to say the whole word, but I did. Good Samaritan or good Sam laws come into play, right? The second question we have here, real quick, Michelle, you're saying like losing owned property for not paying property taxes, no victim or tax evasion. There is no victim. There's 100%. There is no victim, right? Because the government shouldn't be technically owning the land, but that's a whole nother episode for a whole nother day, right? All land should be privately owned, all of it. The state shouldn't have anything to do with that, but here we are, right? Anyway, that's another whole nother argument for a whole nother day. With that, let's jump on into part 2 here. Um, and I've called this ethical rejection. Why the maxi state violates the NAP, or the non-aggression axiom, right? And the maxi state is, let's just use United States federal government. The United States federal government is the maxi state. They have more 3-letter, 4-letter agencies under one 3-letter agency than we can shake a stick at. 400, I think it's 449 total agencies within the federal government. Freaking ridiculous. But anyway, I digress. So let's talk about this a second, okay? Because the vast majority of modern American government activity, okay, is morally indefensible because it requires the initiation of force. I want to say that again, right? Majority of the actions of the federal government is morally indefensible because it requires the initiation of force. What is those examples? Mandatory compliance. Or here's even a better one, taxation. Those are the two biggest ones, right? And they go hand in hand, right? Because you are told you must pay taxes. You must pay these income taxes to the federal government. You must pay it, or else. See how that goes hand in hand? So the question now becomes, what is the ethical rejection of these regulatory mandates, right? Because we got to understand, right? Any law that restricts the use of your own property or body where no one else's rights are violated is an immoral act of initiatory force. Okay. So let me give you a one. I can probably think of two. Let me give you two examples, and I'm going to give you one of them. Let's talk about victimless crimes a second, right? Now, consider all the laws against drugs. Let's take Mary Jane, right? Let's take the Mary Jane. Let's take the marijuana, right? We got states that have permitted marijuana, but it's still, right? It's still on schedule on the federal level, which means if you're caught with it by a federal officer, you can go to jail, right? Gambling is another one, right? Consensual gambling, right? It's another one. Now, the government enforces these laws, right, under the threat of police action or fines or imprisonment, if not if not both, right? Now, since the individual consuming the marijuana or placing a bet is not initiating force against anyone else, right? The state's enforcement is an initiation of force against a non-aggressor, right? With that being said, we have U.S. federal prisons, state prisons, housing hundreds of thousands of people for drug offenses, right? Guy got caught with an ounce of marijuana. He's in jail 10 years because they think he had the intent to distribute. They think he did, right? And let's keep it real. If we're going to keep it real and keep it consistent, this whole war on drugs, they call it, right, is an ongoing, massive violation of the non aggression axiom, right? Using our taxpayer money and state coercion to punish nonviolent individuals who have not aggressed upon anyone, right? Because keep in mind, a minarchist government, a minarchist state rejects all victimless crime laws as fundamentally immoral based on the NAP. I want you to think about that a second. Got another example for you, and this is one of this is my wheelhouse, as a lot of you know, right? Zoning and planning and licensing, right? So if a person in your town, right, is fined for running a hair braiding business out of their home without a specific permit or state license, what does the state do? They initiate force, right? Fines and court orders, right? Against that person, right? Now, since they are not defrauding or physically harming their neighbors, the state's action in this case is initiatory. Therefore, it is also immoral, right? And this is another way the government controls the local economy. They come up with licensing, right? Majority of the people, especially with melanated folk in particular, majority of the people that braid hair is the Monique down the street, right? You got Taraj around the corner projects that braid hair, right? You got Lady Pum Pum around the corner do a dreadlock. They're not licensed. But as soon as the city finds out they're making a little bit of money off of doing the dreadlock, they're gonna bring the police, the sheriff, and the code enforcement and everybody you can chunk at that person. Right? They ain't done anything to nobody. People come to them for a service. Come get your dreadlock today, boy. No, no, you can't do that. It's the same thing that applies to those of you that bake food in your house or freeze dry food, right, in your house. You gotta have a cottage license, right? And you gotta follow cottage law in the state you're in, right? Why? Why? Hmm? Why must you follow there's no victim. A person voluntarily pulls up and buys your cookies or buy your freeze-dried food, right? Even what's even funnier, right? What's even funnier, right? Let's think about this a minute, right? Let's think about this a minute. If you got to have a cottage license to sell baked goods out of your garage on the weekends, right? Or your freeze dried food, oh, you got to be regulated and take classes. But your grocery store is putting sawdust and pink stuff in your ground beef, right? And that's USDA inspected. We got a problem, Houston, don't we? The federal government permits grocery stores to potentially put sawdust and other fillers in the ground beef in your grocery stores, but they want to make the individual like me and you get a cottage license, sit through classes to sell baked goods out of my garage every weekend. Hmm? So I see the question in the chat about a cottage license. So basically, what a cottage license does is it's basically a sell food from home permit. Basically, in layman's terms, without getting into the nitty gritty of that, right? Every state in the union, I think you have to have a cottage license or cottage food license, right? Because you're making the food in home, right? And your kitchen is unlicensed, right? If you go into those you in a restaurant business or have been in, you you understand this concept, right? Every restaurant has a license, right? Every kitchen has a license. You can have a restaurant, you can have a bar, right? For example, you have a bar, you want to sell liquor, you got to have a what? A liquor license. If you want to you want to have an establishment like let's say the Outback or the Applebee's, you got to have a food handler's license, right? For people that want to sell because they have to license the kitchen. You can't license a kitchen inside of a private home because right, that's private property. Right in that context, it's on residential property as opposed to commercial property, right? Different regulations. So, for in order for you to sell food out of your house legally, because your house cannot be licensed, you got to get a cottage license to do so, right? And I think Trish pulled up same point, right? Just like to sell at a farmer's market, you need a farmer's license to sell at a farmer's market, right? Same thing, right? Fairs too, same thing. You got to have that license. So these are the things, right? As we're going through this, these are the things that are crazy, right? And yes, Miss Val, the government shutdown wasn't an act of aggression, technically speaking. Yes, we can, because the whole it surrounded money, right, taxation, etc. We can break that down definitely here in the very near future, right? But again, right, this is where all that comes into play, right? The individual, the man, the living man on the land, right, cannot even sell items except for a garage sale on his property. There's no victim. But again, right? Again, if you don't have that cottage license or that farmer's license, they're coming for you. They're coming for you, right? Let's get to the next part, right? This next part of this part two of this segment, I've outlined as the ethical rejection of redistribution, and we just went through this during this government shutdown, right? This government shutdown, right? about the SNAP benefits and all that money and the Obamacare bullshit. See, I'm going to give you the ethical rejection for redistribution, okay? Because these programs like SNAP, like Obamacare, right, involve the forced transfer of wealth, right? And how whatever their goal, right? And let's don't be coy. I would love for all Americans to have at least mid-major health care in this country. I would love to see that, right? But the government forcing a transfer of wealth, aka taxation, is one of the biggest egregious violations on the non-aggression axiom, right? Let's use another example, right? Let's take the mandatory Social Security tax on every paycheck, right? This tax is used to fund retirement benefits for others, okay? And the individual contributing this money has not committed theft, fraud, or any type of aggression. But the government's collection of this tax is backed by the threat of force, right? Either they'll fine you or seize your assets, right? We've talked about civil asset forfeiture before, right? And since the individual is a non-aggressor, the collection of this tax is an initiation of force against their property, right? Let's flip the script on this one. Let's flip the script on this one a second, right? The United States Congress, which are, according to Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, have the power in their purse, right? But they continually pass massive spending bills for programs like Medicare and foreign aid, don't they? Right? As minarchists and libertarians, right? True small government people, our ethical system rejects this funding entirely, right? Because the moral intent does not justify the immoral method, right? The moral intent meaning helping people, right? And the immoral intent meaning the coercion via taxation, right? The current federal budgetary process is, per the non-aggression axiom, a continuous cycle of institutionalized coercion, right? Remember, I said before, and I say it bluntly all the time, don't pay your tax, and them people coming through to that door with their pistols out telling you need to prove to them that you paid. Not the other way around, not where they come to the door and say, we have proof you didn't pay, come with us. No. They come to your door with that warrant and say, you need to prove to us you paid it. Maybe we have record, maybe we don't. But they're going to come to your face with guns and even kill you if you flinch. I'm not sensationalizing this situation. I'm not sitting here and trying to put fear, but this is the God honest truth. The IRS is the only government agency that does not have to prove you're guilty. You have to prove your innocence to the IRS. Under the threat of force, a gun in your face, and handcuffs. Again, I'll say it again for everybody in the back. This budgetary process is a continuous cycle of institutionalized coercion under the threat of force, if not death. because this government wants their money. They don't care how they get it. And if they don't get it, they take it out on you in blood and throw you in some of the worst prisons they have on the federal level because you didn't pay them their money. I don't see the political left, air quotes, you can't see my hands, calling the IRS Gestapo, calling them fascists. Hmm? The IRS does not operate within the confines of the Constitution of the United States due process, right? You don't hear them calling them Gestapo. Hmm? They got the whole game twisted, don't they, y'all? Hey, look, before we get into part 3 and the last part of this here, make sure y'all are liking and subscribing. I greatly appreciate it. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you subscribe to us on the social medias, Torch of Liberty Media Foundation. Make sure you're sharing it with your peoples because, we have a country to save. And Minarchy is the only ethical state that can save the liberty of people. Even from that dimwit Zoran Mamdani, right? Minarchy is going to save the human condition and save liberty. Nothing else will. Not a Democrat or a Republican is going to save the liberties that we are to protect. Because obviously we know they're not trying to protect it, so we have to do it. So make sure you like and subscribe and all that good stuff. Send it out to your peoples so they can sit here and hang out with us on Sundays, Mondays, Tuesdays, and Fridays up in this BZ. I appreciate y'all. With that, let's get back. Part 3 of this lovely episode I'm calling the state as the ethical police force. Yeah, I know it sounds kind of contradictory to what we explained before, but I'm going to explain it to you. Right? Now, obviously, the police force or your sheriff, right, should be retaliatory only. Right? Should be retaliatory only, right? Because remember, the only ethical justification for a minimal state, okay, lies in the strict adherence to the non-aggression axiom, right? And its exception to it, which is retaliatory force. Okay. Now, the state's only morally justified functions are those that respond to an aggression that has already occurred. Remember, the aggression have already had to happen, like a contract violation or property rights violation, right? That's the only time your law enforcement, right, should be getting involved, right? Because their function is exclusively to respond to aggression, right? Theft, assault, murder, again, property rights violations, and they're to apprehend the aggressor, right? Because this force is strictly retaliatory, right? Again, for example, right? I shouldn't have to give you an example to it, but I'm going to for the people that may not be catching on later on after they listen to this, right? A sheriff's deputy, right, responds to a burglary, okay, and retaliating against the aggressor who initiated the initial force against the homeowner's property is a moral act of defense of the individual's property that was called out to them, right? Now, the deputy initiating the force, right, in the same as against a speeding driver who hasn't harmed anyone in this context is an immoral act of aggression, right? I know some people will disagree with that, but again, the state cannot be a victim. So where's the aggression when it comes to a speeding ticket, right? Where's the who? How's it? You people? You'd have to justify the state, right, being a victim, and how does it become a victim in order for it to act in a retaliatory force against the speeder? Because the laws are supposed to be for the people by the people, not for the government, right? Anyway, I digress. Let's talk about taxation. Okay. Because now the only ethical justification for taxation is that it represents the necessary cost of rights protection, right? And this is the price paid by everyone to maintain the framework that secures their life and property from constant aggression, right? This is the only type of coercion that Minarchy would even accept, as it is viewed as the minimal necessary payment to prevent the breakdown in a state of nature where rights are constantly violated. So let me put this in plain speak, okay? The consumption tax, which we talked about in the last Minarchist series, right? The path to Minarchy, right? When we talked about taxation, right? We talked about implying a consumption tax, which would be like a sales tax, right? And again, some of you will be like, well, that's still taxing, but it's not forcing you to pay it under the threat of force. You're paying that under your own volition because you want the product. And those taxes will be allocated, aka itemized on your receipt, where how much percent of that you paid in sales tax, where is it going? Right? Where is it going? Oh, it's going to fund police, it's going to fund the justice system, it's going to fund the national defense, right? You voluntarily. So if you keep all your money and don't purchase anything that has a tax on it, or you're good, right? You're good. But if you go purchase something that has a sales tax on it, that is still good because you are participating in it. They're not forcing you to pay the tax, right? Consumption tax will always be good because it doesn't force anyone. The state says if you want this, you got to pay a tax fee to purchase this item, which is fine, right? Because you're doing it involuntarily. You're not stuck with a gun stuck to your head saying you got to pay, you got to come pay these. No, you're not doing that, right? So to wrap this up, I'm just gonna say this loud and proud because y'all know how I do. Minarchy is the ethical mandate, right? Because the non-aggression axiom serves as the ultimate moral litmus test for government power. Any expansion beyond the core functions of police, courts, and defense requires the immoral initiation of force against non-aggressors. I want to say that again so that we're clear. The non-aggression axiom serves as the ultimate moral litmus test for government power. Any expansion beyond its core functions of police, courts, and defense requires an immoral initiation of force against non-aggressors. With that being said, the minimal state is not just a preference, it is the only form of government that can claim to operate with ethical consistency under the non aggression axiom in comparison to the vast, expansive, and, and the redistributive and regulatory state of the federal government in our country fails this fundamental moral test every single day. Next week, we'll take this concept a bit further in episode 4. I've already named it the self-ownership doctrine, body, mind, and life. In this episode, we will explore how this moral cornerstone condemns all forms of state control over personal and non-violent conduct. Until then, remember, morality is found in the method, not the outcome. Love your neighbors, love your family, but ultimately, if you don't love yourself, you cannot love anyone or anything else. Until next time, y'all. Peace and love.